the North won. After the Civil War, carpetbaggers from the North came south during Reconstruction. Presidential Reconstruction was lenient. Radical Reconstruction was harsh. Thaddeus Stevens and others wanted to bring blacks more rights, establish a Freedmen's Bureau, and use the Reconstruction Acts of 1867 to militarily divide the South. The 13th Amendment, abolition, 14th, citizenship, and the 15th, male suffrage, were passed during Reconstruction. Resentment led to the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. They terrorized newly freed slaves and free blacks. Reconstruction ended after the election of 1876, and the South established Home Rule, where Jim Crow segregation, sharecropping, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses led to the denial of rights for decades. The Gilded Age came later. Unions like the Knights of Labor were formed, which let African Americans and women join. Samuel Gompers led the AFL, which was concerned with major issues, or bread and butter issues, such as wages. During this time, presidents supported employers in strikes, such as the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 and the Pullman Strike. Robber barons made trusts and monopolies that exploited consumers, though some also did give some charity, as seen with Andrew Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth. Remember, at this time, Republicans favored the rich, like robber barons, and want to raise tariffs. Democrats want to decrease tariffs and favor helping the poor. The Sherman Antitrust Act was made to break up these trusts, but it mostly broke up unions at first. Trust really didn't get busted until Teddy Roosevelt became president. Speaking of Teddy Roosevelt, he sure loved to conserve nature, and he had a big stick. During the age of imperialism, America expanded all around the world. Much territory came out of the Spanish-American War, which gained public support through yellow journalism and the sinking of the Maine. Hey, don't forget about John Hay's open-door policy, which protected American trade in China. As for TR, though, with his big stick and corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, Roosevelt established American dominance in the Caribbean. He was influential in putting the Panama Canal on the map. Free land from the Homestead Act brought many people to the West. A transcontinental railroad connected the country. In the West, Native Americans continued to be oppressed. That's why Helen Hunt Jackson attributed this century as being a century of dishonor. Going back to the Trail of Tears, first earlier in the century, now later in the century, you had the Dawes Act, which looked to westernize Native Americans, and the Wounded Knee Massacre, which left many Sioux dead after they did a ghost dance to protest oppression. Immigrants came over in droves. Old immigration was from Western European places such as Ireland and Germany before the Civil War. New immigration was from Eastern and Southern Europe around 1900. By the 1920s, quotas were set up to limit new immigrants after a Red Scare. The Chinese were excluded, and the Gentleman's Agreement kept out the Japanese. This animosity towards foreigners is called nativism. Immigrants moved to the cities because that's where the jobs were. Immigrants were poor, however, and Jacob Riis showed everyone how the other half lived. Women reformers such as Jane Addams started settlement houses to aid immigrants in need. The populists emerged as an important third party. They wanted more silver to be put into the currency to weaken it. This would raise their crop prices. William Jennings Bryan lost the election of 1896 after giving the Cross of Gold speech. The populists never got their silver. Still, their ideas, such as direct election of senators, a graduated income tax, Australian ballot, and railroad regulation, became law during the Progressive Era. Other progressive reforms included direct primaries, prohibition, and giving women the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. Also, muckrakers helped bring attention to bad stuff happening in the country. Ida B. Wells spoke out against lynching, Ida Tarbell helped break up Standard Oil, and Upton Sinclair got people sick when they read The Jungle. His book helped lead to the Meat Inspection Act and the Food and Drug Administration. Woodrow Wilson stole the election of 1912 after Taft and TR split the vote. World War I broke out, and we got involved because of the boat, Lusitania, and the note, Zimmerman telegram. A draft protester named Charles Schenck created a clear and present danger, and his actions were not free speech according to the Supreme Court. After the war, the U.S. would not ratify the Treaty of Versailles because it questioned our neutrality. Just ask Henry Cabot Lodge, who had reservations about the League of Nations. In the Roaring Twenties, flappers pushed the envelope on women's behavior, a Harlem Renaissance of African-American culture gave us jazz, and new products like washing machines were being purchased by a consumer culture. A guy named John Stokes was brought to trial for teaching about the theory of evolution in school. The 20s ended with a bust because of overproduction of crops, speculation of stocks, buying on credit, bank failures, and the stock market crash. President Hoover failed to save the day.
The only thing we have to fear.
So Franklin Delano Roosevelt won the election of 1932 and took over with a New Deal. AAA, FDIC, CCC, WPA, NIRA, NRA, Wagner Act, and Social Security Act. Thank goodness for Keynesian economics, as deficit spending helped us pay for all of it. The Supreme Court didn't like the New Deal. Just ask the sick chickens. The United States stayed neutral again before World War II and gave billions of dollars in aid with the Lend-Lease Act. The U.S. was pulled into the war after Pearl Harbor. D-Day was the Normandy invasion and opened up a new front in Europe for the Allies. The Allies won after Truman ordered the dropping of the atomic bomb on Japan. During the war, Japanese Americans were relocated from the West Coast and brought to internment camps. The Supreme Court said that this was okay in a time of war in their decision of Korematsu versus the United States. The Yalta Conference gave so much power and land to Joseph Stalin that the Cold War began. The United States preached containment, or stopping the spread of communism. The Truman Doctrine gave military aid to countries in need, such as Greece and Turkey. The Marshall Plan offered economic assistance to those resisting communism. During the Cold War, there was the Berlin airlift. The Soviets shot Sputnik into orbit, which led to Americans spending more on education. And also, there was the U-2 spy plane incident. Fear of communism led to the witch hunt of Joseph McCarthy, as during the 1950s, many civil liberties were limited. The Rosenbergs were executed for selling secrets to the Soviets. In 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion proved to be costly, as President John F. Kennedy could not remove communist leader Fidel Castro from power in Cuba. But the peak of the Cold War was the Cuban Missile Crisis, when John Fitzgerald Kennedy called for a blockade of Cuba and threatened force if Soviet missiles weren't taken out of the area. They were, and the world kept spinning. But what about Korea and Vietnam? The United States practiced the domino theory with fears that all of Asia would turn red. Truman fired Douglas MacArthur during Korea as he was overstepping his boundaries. The DMZ was established at the 38th parallel. Dien Bien Phu fell in Vietnam. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution gave Lyndon Johnson a blank check to escalate forces. The Tet Offensive decreased American morale as the communists pushed south in Vietnam. There were protests as young folk singers such as Phil Ochs and Bob Dylan sang about ending the war. This counterculture movement spread throughout the nation as a new generation of young Americans offered a backlash to Vietnam. In 1970, a protest of overseas military operations led to shootings at Kent State. What about civil rights? After the 1896 case, Plessy versus Ferguson, which said that separate but equal was constitutional, Brown versus the Board of Education of 1954 said otherwise, and led to desegregation of schools. This was a decision of Earl Warren's court, which also extended the rights of the accused in Mapp versus Ohio, Gideon versus Wainwright, and Miranda versus Arizona. As for civil rights leaders to know in the 1900s, Booker T. Washington aimed for gradual gains, but W.E.B. Du Bois wanted equality for blacks. So did Martin Luther King Jr., who had a dream. Some, such as Stokely Carmichael and the Black Panthers, wanted black separatism. Also regarding civil rights, the 1969 Stonewall riots led to the creation of gay activist organizations and rallied the LGBT community. Let's talk about the last several decades. In 1962, Rachel Carson kicked off the environmental movement with her book, Silent Spring. Around this time, too, Cesar Chavez fought for the rights of migrant farm workers. Lyndon Johnson had a great society where he looked to help the poor and less fortunate. However, he was mostly remembered for Vietnam. Richard Nixon quit after the Watergate scandal and battled inflation. Gas prices skyrocketed during the 1970s because OPEC embargoed oil. Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan were Washington outsiders. Carter had an energy crisis, but brokered the Camp David Accords to bring some peace to the Middle East. During this time, women wanted an equal rights amendment. One woman to know is Betty Friedan. She wanted women to be free. Dan? Regarding women's rights, the 1973 Roe v. Wade decision protected a woman's right to choose to have an abortion. Ronald Reagan helped bring an end to the Cold War, but also you should know about Reaganomics, which means that wealth should trickle down. George Bush invaded Iraq to liberate Kuwait, signed the Americans with Disabilities Act, and was hurt by a recession. The economy recovered under Bill Clinton. Clinton had NAFTA, which aided trade among North American countries. He sent NATO troops to Bosnia to end human rights violations. He also got impeached for, you can ask your parents about that. George W. Bush invaded Afghanistan and Iraq after 9/11 and left office amidst an economic crisis. Barack Obama, the first African-American president, repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell for serving in the military. He also favored health care and stimulus packages to deal with the recession. During his presidency, there was a massive increase in national debt. Subscribe to this channel to get more reviews like this one. For more reviews, you can